Janet Hurley and Nick Zaiac from Manchester and Arlington, respectively, talking about zoning ordinances and changes, sort of building on the work of the last panel.
So Manchester is just to the northeast of us. And I'm going to talk to you about how Manchester in the last 6 years has changed its zoning and the other things that we've done toward trying to realize housing that is so needed in our town. Go ahead, John. So in 2016, Manchester, the village of Manchester and the town of Dorset got a municipal planning grant and did what was termed the Northshire Economic Development Strategy. And this is my favorite graphic from that, that report. And what it shows is that this is pre-pandemic, of course, but Manchester had nearly 3,000 people that worked in the town of worked in the Northshire, so Manchester, Manchester Village, and Dorset, that lived more than 25 minutes away. And then the number of people that both lived and worked in Manchester was half that. And then there were also about that many people that worked in Manchester but lived in Manchester but worked elsewhere, say Rutland or Bennington or somewhere else altogether. So go ahead, John. So that graphic basically shows you that there's a housing shortage in Manchester. And it's long been known that we had one. When I came on board at the end of 2014, we had a zoning ordinance that really hadn't been comprehensively looked at in 40 years. And what had happened is that the 7 basic zoning districts that were laid down in 1970 hadn't changed, and what had changed was that there were multiple overlay districts that kept being added, and it made for a really convoluted, very difficult to understand ordinance. And so we got another municipal planning grant, and we engaged Brandy Saxton, and we went through this 3-year effort to rezone the whole town. And basically following some of the principles that Jacob and Jim both laid out. And so we went from 7 basic districts to 12 basic districts. And actually, I should explain here, the black hole in the middle is Manchester Village, where the town has no jurisdiction for zoning. So the colored zoning districts are the town of Manchester. In any case, we created districts that reflected both what was on the ground and what the town's aspirations are as defined in the town plan. And key is our center, which you saw the picture of our function junction, which is right about there. There are 2 downtown districts, one called downtown, one called town center. And surrounding those districts, we created a residential district that would allow 10 units per acre. And that was a radical increase to what was allowed in Manchester. And then as you get further away from that center, there are decreasing levels of housing density that were allowed. So we radically increased residential density in the core. In these 2 commercial districts or mixed-use districts in the core, there is no upper limit on density. If you can fit it, you can provide the sewer and the water, you can fit it within the height restrictions, you can put that many there. So go ahead, John, next slide. One of the other provisions that we added is called adaptive reuse, and it would allow the conversion of non-residential structures to housing without regard to the density limits of the underlying zoning district. So in the outer reaches, we have this, what used to be the inn at Willow Pond, And right before the pandemic, the DRB approved this, the conversion of these 3 buildings here that had 40 lodging units in them to 40 units of housing. However, I think both due to probably financing issues with the owner group, but also permit issues with the state, this has floundered and it may not happen. So, but we have this provision and we would love to see it used to create housing in Manchester in larger numbers than we've seen in a long time. Go ahead, John. So some of the other changes that we made sure to include in this rewrite was to allow for very small dwelling units, tiny houses, I guess you could call them, giving height bonuses for underbuilding parking and affordable and workforce housing. And one of the things I didn't put in this list, but Jim pointed out, is we also changed our parking requirements so that you didn't need 2 parking units for every housing unit, particularly in the core. And some other changes with parking about shared parking arrangements and such for shared uses or mixed uses. We defined workforce housing very broadly. I think it was one of Stephanie's first slides where she showed the police officer and the teacher, and it's one of John's favorite examples that we don't have a police officer in the Manchester Police Force that lives in the town of Manchester. And it's largely because there is no housing for a family such as what Stephanie pictured in Manchester. Or if there is, it is snatched up before anybody even barely knows it's on the market. So we defined workforce housing very broadly when we gave these bonuses for such housing development. And then to encourage the conservation of open space in the outer reaches, we changed the we changed the allowable density significantly. We had 2-acre zoning throughout town, and we changed that to 5, 10, and 25 in those outer districts. But we also allowed that anyone with at least 4 acres could still subdivide their property if they provided permanent protection of at least half and at least 70%, depending on the zoning district, and that they could get 3 bonus housing units and place those in a clustered fashion. So hopefully, that will also help in terms of getting a few housing units in the outer reaches. So we did a lot of what Jim and Jacob both talked about, and we can do more, and the Planning Commission continues to talk about changes to the regulations that could continue to help. One that I've asked them to consider is to eliminate single-family zoning, single-family house units. So certain districts say you can have single-family, duplex, multifamily, and various other categories of housing unit uses. If instead we just regulated on that density allowance that we've already said we want to see for those districts, maybe we shouldn't care whether it's a single-family home or multifamily or something in between. And then we do allow for the conversion of any single-family home to a duplex within a certain distance from the core, which is defined, I think, as 2,500 feet from the roundabout that I showed in that first slide. But maybe we should offer that for anywhere in town. That's also something we could consider. I think it was Jim talked about accessory dwelling units, but we could look at that 30% measure, that maybe that loosen the restriction a little bit about the size of that accessory dwelling unit. Maybe it could be smaller or even larger. And then finally, just Monday, the Planning Commission started talking about whether we should consider regulating short-term rentals. There's a feeling that maybe short-term rentals are pushing housing units out of the market for people that want to live in Manchester. I think that's something that we need to study. It's something that, you know, as a resort destination, you have to be careful about. We need a certain number of lodging units in our town to support the visitor-based economy, but can we do it in such a way that doesn't put pressure on the housing market? Can we look at this in a way that could also help provide more housing for people to live in Manchester as their primary residence? Go ahead, John. So in addition to the zoning, and one of the reasons for some of the zoning changes was so that we could take advantage of the neighborhood development area designation. We got you can see this, it's kind of faded in the light here, but we have a village center designation that goes from about the intersection of Depot Street with Main Street, northeasterly along Main Street. And we got that in 2013, right, Jacob? Because it's renewal today, or renewal this year was up. So after our zoning changes, we were able to get this neighborhood development area approved. You can see there's a chunk that probably should have been part of that approval that wasn't, and that's because in order to be eligible for this NDA designation, you have to have sewer service. And Manchester actually does not currently provide sewer service in this rather historic area right adjacent to our town center. So that's something that we're working on providing, hopefully within a year, and hopefully something that Bill can take advantage of in his development, where he talked about demolishing this particular house right here to make room for a 20-unit residential development. But so we got this NDA designation, we did the zoning, and then we got another municipal planning grant. And we did a market study to try to understand whether there was a market for, or what that market was for downtown housing units. And this was accomplished in 2019. This first graph just sort of shows you that Manchester stands out in that it has a much higher incidence of jobs per workforce than any other town in the area. The only other town that comes close is Peru, and that's because it's got Bromley Mountain Resort there. Again, these are pre-pandemic numbers, and this sort of reflects a lot of what we've heard earlier, that the households in Manchester are mostly, almost 70%, 1 to 2 person households. But the housing stock is predominantly stock that is 3-bedroom or more. So there's a little disconnect between what people need and what we have. And then this is just an indication that Manchester has more retail sales per resident than almost anywhere in the state. I think we're second only to Williston. And again, those are pre-pandemic numbers, but just an indication of what Manchester's economy is. And go ahead to the next slide. Oh, I guess, well, basically what that study showed is that we have a need for, there is a market for downtown housing in Manchester, and it's a strong market. There's a strong demand for housing in the downtown, and there is such a demand that no one project could possibly fulfill that demand. So we continued with our municipal planning grants, and we engaged White and Burke real estate advisors to look at 2 different sites in our downtown to develop pro formas to show whether we could realize a mixed-use development in our downtown with significant numbers of housing units. So they looked at providing 40 units of housing in these 2 locations. One is currently a vacant parcel in front of the Hampton Inn on Main Street, and the other is a town-owned parcel that has 3,000 square foot footprint retail buildings, and it's about a 1.4 acre parcel. So we looked at putting housing on the back of this lot and repurposing the units up front. And so what White and Burke's analysis found is that it doesn't pencil out, even with the new zoning, even with the neighborhood development area designation. So what else can we do? And what can the state do to maybe help make something like this happen? But what we've decided at this point is that we're going to pursue something on this site. And John is going to talk to you a little bit more about that later. My last slide is just sort of a tip-off to what John's going to show you. This is that site. These are the 3 buildings. I couldn't really get a decent picture because the trees were all... sorry. Oh, it's 301 Depot Street on Depot Street in Manchester. No, this is the Price Chopper right here and the TJ Maxx. So it's sort of next to that. This is a pizza house, and this is Starbucks and Pendleton Subway. So in any case, John's going to talk to you more about that, but suffice it to say that we've made all these changes. We've used the municipal planning grant program, we think, very productively, and the only way that we think this can happen is if the town takes the initiative and makes it happen. The market's just not going to bear it otherwise. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Janet. That really paints a picture of a town that's at the end of or in the middle of the long-term reconsideration of what its rules are and what its infrastructure can support to allow for more infill housing. In many ways, Arlington is at the beginning of this process, but we're not at the very beginning. Our first code came into effect in the early 1970s. It was revised, 17 times since. And our first study of wastewater in this town was in 1978. So people have been thinking about this for something like 50 years and acknowledging that the 2 aspects of the town that need to be considered if we are to allow for more infill housing are wastewater and zoning reform or the planning process. Water is not necessarily a part of that conversation. Arlington is gushing with water. We have lots of capacity there, but the wastewater capacity and the zoning capacity are not. Thankfully, there have been real concerted steps, as Jim alluded to in his conversation. There was a wastewater plant built up at the school just up the hill. It still has surplus capacity, and one of the challenges that this select board will have is figuring out if that plant can be used to expand wastewater service and provide for opportunities for infill development in the area immediately adjacent to the plant. But that effort will be taken up by a subcommittee that will look at as Jim alluded to, moving the outlet further downstream to increase the capacity. What could be implemented to upgrade the plant and increase its maximum capacity, and setting the scope for sewer line 1. Which direction does it go? And the plant is up the top of a hill, so there's going to be complications with that no matter where it goes. So I'll put some caveats on first. This isn't a plan with consensus opinion of the select board. This is a highly political issue that the people will have to decide and voice their opinions on if we are to move forward, before we start to talk about the idea of a bond-funded sewer expansion. That doesn't mean it's not important, and the fact that the select board, despite lack of political consensus, has agreed to look at this is a step that has gone further than any point that I can find in the last 30 years. So we're really pleased that the current political leaders are willing to consider this once again and see whether this project is the project, or maybe it's not. Maybe there's a project that doesn't reuse the existing capacity that's there, and maybe we do need to look at a new build sewer plant, a lot like the Pownell plant that's been built. But that's not the only conversation. There are going to be a number of innovative solutions, including for East Arlington, that we have had studies done on, that could allow for wastewater solutions that do not require massive investments. So that addresses the wastewater component, and thankfully we're pleased that there is money around for planning and things like that. So this is something that we're hoping is not being borne by the taxpayers at large in the long run. So moving on to planning capacity. Arlington is pursuing a municipal planning grant to seek some guidance on what we can and should be doing to modernize the Arlington bylaw. Like many other towns, the bylaw was implemented in the 1970s, and while it's been revised a whole lot of times, it has not been comprehensively revised in many decades. The bylaw is certainly showing its age. It's hard to use. It's not easy to understand for the small-time developers that we have that need to be looking at a document that they can know exactly what they can build. But beyond that, it's not just a hard-to-use document. It's a document that binds in many important ways. But which of those ways are politically acceptable to the residents of Arlington and a representative group of the residents of Arlington, not the ones who show up to my normal planning commission hearings? But certainly it's something where we're going to have to consider the many things that Jim suggested. Looking at parking requirements and looking at what we can do about setbacks and massing rules, and whether some zones need to be, like Manchester did, split off, redesigned, or in some cases merged. Arlington has certainly considered and made a lot of efforts on this in the past, but they very rarely have looked at things in a comprehensive way with an eye toward infill housing. What can we actually do to make more housing be built? There's definitely some great ideas, and I certainly am not going to speak for what's going to come out of that political process, but we're excited that the Planning Commission and the Arlington Select Board have taken up the opportunity that's been presented by state grant funding for these projects, and is taking the opportunity to seriously look at all of these things, not just with an eye toward making Arlington an easier place to understand what you can build, but making it an easier place for you to actually be able to build. And those are a couple of things that a town that is not one of us can take away from this. These many towns have aging plans for ideas that came out of the 1970s that could have led to the planning for the infrastructure that we now need to facilitate infill housing today. Just because a plan is from the 1970s does not mean it's all bad, and there's certainly lessons to be learned. Not a whole lot has changed with a lot of the East Arlington planning in particular here. And I certainly am not alone in that opportunity. So I encourage you to all go through your archives, look at what has been studied, and then go out and apply for money to go and look at this in a more comprehensive way. And it may be that wastewater is not your constraint. It may be that water is your constraint, which faces a similar process, or it may be that the planning bylaws is your constraint. That's something that very clearly the state has put $500,000 aside to plan for this. We're going the municipal planning grant route, which does not follow the route of the bylaw modernization grants, if only because the work that our bylaw needs is far more great of scope than the more narrow rules associated with the planning and the modernization grant money. So even if you look at your problem, you assess your needs, and you see that the planning grant is not, or the bylaw modernization grant money is not going to cover exactly what you need to do, go out, figure out what you want, and apply for funding for the study that you really want, not the study that you feel like you need to do because that may not fit your designated village centers. Only then are you going to get to the outcome of the infill housing that you're going to need. But to get there, you need to start the conversation, and you need to acknowledge that this is a political process. Just because there is not consensus among your politicians that this is what you need to do, does not mean you can't think about it. You can acknowledge that housing is an urgent need for all of us, and not let a couple of holdouts or some doubts now at the early stage of the process get in the way of thinking about where you can be and planning how you can do your part to make sure that you're building the infill housing that will make this state available and viable to adapt to the housing market that we actually face today. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
That's a question.
Why do the projects in Manchester not pencil out?
So cost of land, I mean, the White and Burke pro forma looked at return on investment, looked at what the rent structures would provide. They looked at assumed vacancy rates. They're very, you as a developer know what needs to pencil out in terms of, embarking on one of these projects in order for you to decide that it's worth going forward. And they were looking at specifically 40 units of housing on a downtown site with mixed commercial use. And in one case, it would have been completely new construction on a vacant parcel. In another, it was reusing 3 existing and adding a multifamily structure in the rear. And it was just too expensive, unless you could tweak some of these, various inputs in their model. They looked at, what were all of them? I can't remember all of them, but...
The point where the penciling out really made sense, where the project was viable, was within striking distance.
It was within striking distance,
So
John's saying.
it's not far-fetched to think that we could do, for example, on the town parcel, that we can do something, but it just means that some of the numbers have to get readjusted, like vacancy rate. So we've tried to think about ways, how can we drive down vacancy rate? Or part of that was factored in was a return on investment to the town. And so if we're willing to drop that number, we have a spreadsheet where we can make adjustments. When you start making adjustments, it doesn't take that many adjustments to make it work.
Right. So, and I don't, maybe I should repeat some of what John said. Could people hear him? Can't tell.
I guess what were the assumptions that, because you could make a project work depending on assumptions, so like did you have target rental rates?
Yeah.
That you were trying to make
Yeah, so
what was that range?
This is, they were market, prevailing assumptions for the development community.
I think we also assumed there's no participation in programs either, which is market rate.
What were you calling market rate?
The numbers, I'll look them up, but I think it depends on how many bedrooms. We were looking at smaller units because it was downtown, so we were looking at 1 and 2 bedroom units, I think.
It was between 1,000 and 1,500. A lot like the Inn Willow Pond project intended to be in that range.
And then the other side, of course, is cost of construction. And what were you figuring there, like on a cost per square foot or something?
I have to look up those numbers.
Yeah.
The big things that you could tweak really were vacancy rate, for example. So in the front, and we've talked about this more, there's some potential uses in the front that would drive down vacancy rate totally.
Right, instead of retail, having office uses or government uses could drive that down.
Like we've looked at relocating municipal buildings down there, or even some regional or county government offices there too, which obviously is a very stable tenant. So you're talking going from a vacancy rate, whatever the assumption was, to basically zero.
Well, why don't we hold off, because you're going to have some slides.
He's going to talk
Because a
about
lot of
that.
people here don't even know what we're talking about in terms of where it is. And so it's too much insider here. Let's wait till you come on and you can show that.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, another question.
This is all about how to make change happen. When I talk to people about increasing housing density, I mentioned to you individually, this panic comes up in people's eyes. They have this idea of swarms of crack-addicted people from who knows where coming into our neighborhoods, changing our way of life. And that's where the processing seems to stop. There's a desire that there be more housing. It's a variant on NIMBY. But so could you talk to how you've made the conversation happen locally, or maybe not made it, but how to bring out the conversation to weigh the fear of future change with the needs?
So there was momentum in Manchester, and maybe partially for following the Function Junction project, which was sort of 20 years in the making. But that reconfiguration of our main intersection led to, I think, the Northshire Economic Development Study, and there's been a long-held concern about a lack of housing in Manchester for people to actually live and work in Manchester rather than just second home development and that. So there was a lot of momentum. There was also a 2020 visit, when did that happen? Was that 2011? And that there were some citizen initiatives that came out of that. And so there was a lot of momentum, and there was a lot of will to change, the zoning. As we increased the height I think the increased height in the downtown was the most controversial. And we had to compromise on that a little bit. And it may be that we need the Planning Commission is already talking about certain properties in the downtown that could probably, we could go higher because of the topography around it and whatnot. So we may need to do that. The other thing is that although we increased density in that core significantly, we reduced it on the outsides in a way that didn't take away development rights from rural landowners. So, so there were, it was a balancing act.
And would it be also fair to say, in response to the question, that our experience with Shire's housing over the years has also helped break down any...
Stephanie in recent years has completely sort of remarketed and redone the housing developments that are in Manchester, and they have a much better image now than they once did. So, are there vacancies still in Manchester, Stephanie? So, yeah, there were vacant units, and now there aren't, so, yeah.
Well, Josh.
Just wanted to ask about that Innit Mill Pond project. Is that vacant? Is anyone living there? Is it
Oh, no, it's stripped down to the studs.
So there's 4 units of housing that could be housing people that is just sitting there?
Yep.
What is the permit issues at the state level?
The conversion of a non-transient...
Conversion of a lodging to full-time housing as if it used more water. Okay.
Right.
Yep.
I see you shaking your head, Josh. That is...
Well,
you can't believe how frustrating it's been to see that hold this up when during the pandemic, the state put up up to 160 people here in lodging for a year. And
on the same drinking systems. The other piece is, Janet, that the well is several feet too close to the highway.
It's 5 feet too close. That's what's making this requirement for a new drilled well. And the developers asked the District 8 coordinator if they could phase the project, and the District 8 coordinator said, unfortunately, no. You have to get all the permitting in place before anything can happen. And so those are all completely stripped down. It seems like we may lose it to a foreclosure process. It's sad. Kind of devastating, really. So.
Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I wanted to respond to your question, which I think really sort of was trying to get at the concept of NIMBYism, which we talked about earlier today. And, I think that in part the answer to that is we hear all the time in every forum and everywhere we go that Vermont needs to attract and retain young people. We need to attract and retain working families. We need to be a state that welcomes newcomers, and we need to be a state that welcomes diversity. And the answer to that is housing. And people have got to be able to move forward in their vision of what our communities look like and who is welcome here and who we're going to be able to provide for. So I know that's a philosophical answer, but in some ways I feel like the answer is philosophical, and we just need to keep telling people, I think, that, the answer is all are welcome here and we're going to build for you.
That's a great question. Dominic.